How would you feel if the person you've loved for 20 years wasn't who you thought they were? This weekend was supposed to be a celebration, but instead, I found myself in the middle of a nightmare. As I settled into my chair and glanced at the clock, I noticed it was just a few minutes shy of 5 p.m. In about an hour, I'd be wrapping things up and heading home to kick off the weekend. Normally, weekends were something I always looked forward to, but this one was going to be extra special. Tomorrow, Thursday, would mark 20 years since I married Lisa, and I couldn't wait to whisk her away for a wild weekend at the lakeside cabin I'd rented. I picked up a framed photo of Lisa from my desk, studying it closely. It was one she gave me years ago, with the words, "The love of my life," written on the back. Oh, by the way, I'm Mike Harrison. Lisa and I met back in college, and right after graduation, we tied the knot. She'd insisted we wait until our wedding night to be intimate, saying it would make everything better in the long run. Turns out, she was right. My folks were over the moon when we got married. They handed me a check for $85,000 and the keys to a townhouse they'd been renting out. It was their way of helping us start our life together. "This is just the first installment," my dad had said. "There's a $5 million trust fund that's been set up for you since birth. You'll get a portion of it every year." My mom passed away not long after I was born, and my dad never spoke much about her. I never pushed him on it either. About a year after she died, he remarried the woman I came to know as Mom. Back in high school, I had considered enlisting in the military, but diabetes took that option off the table. I managed it through diet and medication, so it didn't stop me from playing soccer or taking martial arts classes. Lisa and I both went to college together. She dreamed of becoming a teacher, while I planned to follow in my father's footsteps into business. Our plans shifted, though, when Lisa got pregnant just 6 months after our wedding. We had a son, Jacob, and it wasn't an easy delivery for Lisa. The doctor suggested she have her tubes tied, and she agreed. Lisa took some time off school to take care of Jacob and went back after he started kindergarten. Eventually, she got her teaching certificate and began working at the local elementary school. Meanwhile, I finished my degree and landed a job as an accountant at New Horizon Corporation. I still remember the day I told my dad about my new job. "New Horizon Corporation, huh?" he asked. New Horizon had been around for nearly 50 years and was a well-known name in manufacturing and logistics, with a solid national presence and lots of potential for growth. "Yeah," I told him. "I'm starting as an accountant. The pay is good, and the benefits are great." "Good. I'm proud of you, son," he said. "I hope it all works out for you." I recall feeling a bit puzzled by his tone. Although he said he was proud, something seemed to be weighing on him. I thought about asking, but I held back. My dad wasn't one to give more information than he thought was necessary, and pushing him wouldn't have gotten me anywhere. The next 14 years went by in what I'd call a pretty standard fashion. We worked, came home, took care of our family. It was the usual routine. My job didn't require much travel, except for the occasional seminar, but we made sure to take a family vacation every summer when Lisa had time off. I gave up martial arts about 5 years after we got married. Life just got too busy with work and raising a kid. I guess that's what happens when you've got a family to take care of. I didn't talk much about my job, but my dad often nudged me to consider other opportunities. I always wondered why he kept bringing it up, but I never dug into it. For the most part, Lisa and I were happy. Sure, like any couple, we had our ups and downs, but things were generally good. Our love life slowed down a bit as we got older, which I guess is normal. But about a month ago, I started noticing something different about Lisa. At first, I figured Lisa's mood swings were just a result of school being out for the summer, and not having to go to work every day was throwing her off. There were moments when she would retreat into herself, becoming distant and quiet. Other times, she'd snap at me, and I couldn't for the life of me understand what I might have done wrong. I tried bringing it up a few times, but she'd just wave me off with a flick of her wrist and walk away. A little while later, she'd come back and apologize for her behavior. Around the same time, I got wind that I was being considered for a promotion. The vice president position had opened up, and I was one of 2 candidates in the running. The other contender was Ben Parker. Ben was a solid guy and deserved the shot, but I felt like I was the better fit for the job. I didn't mention the promotion to anyone, not even Lisa. I figured I'd wait until I knew more before saying anything, so I doubted it was connected to the change in her behavior. It wasn't until later that I realized everything in our house had been shifting. Jacob had just graduated high school and was off to attend the United States Military Academy at Redstone. In fact, he was already on his way there. Maybe, I thought, Lisa was struggling with the idea of an empty nest and feeling the weight of it. That's when the idea hit me: why not take her away for a weekend to celebrate our anniversary? I decided a surprise trip might be just what she needed to snap her out of the funk she was in. At 4:15, the phone on my desk rang, snapping me back to the present. I answered, and it was my secretary on the other end. "Mr. Harrison," she said. "Mr. Montgomery just called and asked if you could meet with him as soon as possible." "Thanks, Megan," I replied. Jacob Montgomery III, or Jake, as everyone called him, was the CEO of Huntley Corporation. When he wanted to see you, there was no keeping him waiting. I figured this had to be about the promotion. I straightened my tie as I looked at myself in the mirror before heading out. As I walked toward the elevator, I pulled out my phone, set it to record audio for an hour, just in case. I always did this for meetings, especially important ones, in case I missed something. I slipped the phone back into my pocket as the elevator doors opened and stepped off on the 12th floor, where all the big shots had their offices. I made my way to Montgomery's suite at the far end of the floor. His assistant, a striking brunette named Katie Turner, glanced up as I walked in. "Mr. Montgomery is ready for you, Mr. Harrison," she said with a slight smirk that left me wondering what that grin was all about. "Come on in," she added. I nodded and pushed open the double doors to Jake's main office. "Ah, Mike, good to see you." "Come on in," Jake greeted me with a wide smile, gesturing toward the seating area. I walked over and sat in the chair he motioned to, which was positioned right across from the couch and coffee table. "Frank, get Mr. Harrison something to drink," Jake said, turning to the large man in a tailored suit. I recognized Frank Morris, one of Jake's personal security guards. I always found it odd that Jake had not one, but 2 guards with him at all times, though I never quite understood why. There had been rumors, but nothing ever confirmed. Frank poured some bourbon into a glass and handed it to me. I didn't drink too often, but Frank knew my preference: straight bourbon, just like my old man. I thanked him as I accepted the glass. Frank gave a nod in response, his expression as stoic as ever. Now that I think about it, I don't think I've ever seen him smile. Jake settled himself on the sofa, having ditched his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves. He was a big guy, barrel-chested, strong, and still in great shape for a man in his 50s. He took a sip of his drink, placed the glass down on the coffee table, and paused for a moment before looking at me, clearly gathering his thoughts before speaking. "Go on, take a drink," Jake said with a grin. "Relax a little, it won't hurt you." I took a small sip of the bourbon, testing it out, before setting the glass down on a coaster he had on the coffee table. "Thank you," I replied. "So, what can I do for you today, Mr. Montgomery?" Jake's smile widened before he said anything. "You know, that's what I admire about you, Mike," he said. "Always so polite, always so courteous. Just the other day, I was telling Barbara that I don't think I've ever seen you stressed out about anything. By the way, how's everything going at home? Things good between you and your wife?" I nodded. "Yeah, everything's going fine," I said. "Our son just left for Redstone Academy, so we're adjusting to that. Actually, I was planning to take Lisa out this weekend for our 20th anniversary." 20 years married? Jake asked. Well, congratulations. Thanks, I replied. Now, I didn't call you in here to mess with you. I like you, Mike, I really do. But I need to have a serious talk with you about the upcoming promotion. As you know, it's down to you and Williams. There are just one or two things the board needs before they can finalize their decision. I see, I said. What exactly does the board need? They want to know how flexible you are, Jake said, leaning back a bit. How do you handle high-pressure situations? How far are you willing to go to help the company meet its goals? You understand that if you step into this role, your workday won't end at 5 o'clock anymore, right? I figured as much, I replied. I'm sure the board has already reviewed my performance, gone through my personnel file. Oh, they have, Jake nodded. But they need more. They want to see firsthand how you operate when the heat is on. I'm sorry, Mr. Montgomery, but I'm not quite following, I said, feeling a bit lost. He took another sip of his bourbon and smiled. Don't worry, you'll get it soon enough, he said. Tell me, Mike, how strong is your marriage? It's solid, Mr. Montgomery, I answered, taking another sip of my drink. Why do you ask? Good to hear, he said. Because I'm afraid you'll need to cancel your plans for the weekend. If your marriage is as strong as you say, I'm sure your wife will understand. He gave a slight nod to Frank, who walked over to the side door and opened it. Then he returned to his position behind my chair. I felt a wave of unease settle in, wondering what was about to unfold. Just then, another guard, George Hill, stepped into the room. But George wasn't alone, Lisa was with him. He guided her over to Montgomery and stepped aside. My heart skipped a beat when I saw her. Lisa was dressed in an extremely short dress that left her back completely exposed. The front was open all the way down to her waist, making it obvious she wasn't wearing a bra. The hem barely covered anything, stopping just inches below her backside. She glanced in my direction, but it was as if she didn't recognize me. When I looked into her eyes, I could tell something was off, her pupils were dilated, and I thought I saw a white substance around one of her nostrils. Lisa, I said, my voice shaking. What are you doing here? Why are you dressed like this? She looked at me, but there was no response. Her eyes were glazed over, and it was clear that she had been drugged. I turned back to Jake, my mind racing. What the hell is going on? I demanded. Why is she here, dressed like this? She's obviously drugged. What did you give her? Jake let out a low chuckle. Come on, Mike, he said, almost amused. You're a smart guy. What do you think is happening here? And yeah, I gave her something. It's a little formula I came up with myself. Makes them, let's just say, very receptive and compliant. Keeps them in that state for hours. I even gave her 3 times the usual dose. He nodded toward Bill, who was standing by Lisa. Bill reached behind her and untied the strap holding up her dress. The fabric slipped, and her breasts were fully exposed. Jake leaned forward and pinched one of them. Lisa didn't flinch or react. I tried to get up from my chair, but suddenly, I realized I couldn't move my arms or legs. What the hell is going on? I thought, and then it hit me, Frank must have slipped something into my drink too. But what was it? Montgomery's evil grin widened as he glanced over at Bill, who was standing right behind Lisa. With a nod from Jake, Bill unzipped her dress, letting it fall to the floor. Now, apart from her high heels, Lisa was completely naked, and she still didn't move a muscle. I've always preferred my women smooth, Jake said casually. Don't you, Mike? She's not your woman. I snapped, feeling a surge of anger rise in my chest. Oh, I see you're finally starting to get worried, he said with a smirk. And we're only just beginning. He reached out, tracing his finger over her bare skin. Get your damn hands off my wife. I shouted, my rage bubbling over, but Frank held me firmly in place, his grip unyielding. Montgomery turned back to me, laughing. Or what? He asked mockingly. You gonna kick my ass? If I calculated everything right, you can't even move right now. Get away from her, you sick son of a, I growled, my fury boiling over. Jake laughed again, unzipping his pants. He dropped his trousers and underwear before signaling to Bill. The large man forced Lisa onto her knees in front of Montgomery. That's when she started doing things to him, and then they had sex. Her eyes stayed glazed over, her body moving as if she didn't even know what was happening. She moaned, like nothing else in the world mattered. I was trembling with rage, desperately trying to free myself from Frank's grip, but my body still wouldn't respond. I glared at Jake, fury blazing in my eyes. I'm gonna kill you, you son of a... I screamed. Montgomery just smiled at me, amused. Well, is that any way to talk to family? He said mockingly. Such foul language, especially in front of your darling wife. She won't be my wife much longer. I spat back. And what do you mean by family? Oh, you mean nobody ever told you? He asked, his grin widening. Told me what? I asked, still confused. How my father got your biological mother pregnant right in front of her husband, Montgomery said with a wicked smirk. That's right, Mike, you and I are half-brothers. That's impossible. I stammered, the shock hitting me like a freight train. Why are you doing this? There are plenty of reasons, he said, his voice cold. First off, I'm the CEO, so I can do whatever I damn well please. Call it executive privilege. Secondly, I've always wanted to humiliate my younger half-brother. You didn't think I hired you because of your grades or your skills, did you? You mean, I started. That's right, he said. I knew your biological mother's husband when he worked for my father. Back then, I was just a kid, not even out of high school. I worked here during the summers, mostly in the mailroom, and eventually climbed my way up. Now, I run the place, just like my father did. I've been keeping tabs on you. Once I saw you graduated from college, I made sure you'd get hired here if you applied. So, you've been planning this all along? I asked, my voice barely steady. Of course, he said casually. This has been in the works for years. I call it the long game. I knew this day would come. And now, Mike, both you and your wife belong to me. He paused for a moment before adding, that brings me to the third reason. I'm taking back what was stolen from my father. What are you talking about? I asked, struggling to comprehend. I've never even met your father. No, but the man you've always called Dad did, Jake explained. He sued my father and the company. Ever wonder where your trust fund came from? Now, I'm taking back what's mine, and I'm going to start by taking it out on your wife. You're insane, you know that. I shot back, disgusted. He shrugged. Maybe, he said calmly. But that's just how it is. Then, leaning forward, he laid it all out. Here's the deal, Mike. You're not going to divorce your wife. She's going to need some extra money to support her new lifestyle, anyway. As I said, she's mine now. From this point forward, she'll be my personal plaything, always available whenever I want her, 24/7. In fact, I'm taking her to Houston for a couple of days to show her off to the board. They've been curious about her. Don't worry, I'll bring her back, though she might be a little worn out. You'll never get away with this. I shouted, my frustration mounting. He chuckled. I already have, he said coolly. And there's not a damn thing you can do to stop me. He nodded toward Bill, who stepped in front of me with a smug grin on his face. It's nothing personal, Mr. Harrison, Bill said. I've always liked you. Just doing my job. With those words, he swung a punch straight into my face. My vision went blurry, and after the third blow, everything went dark. When I woke up, I immediately realized I was in a hospital room. The steady beeping of machines filled the air, and I could feel the plastic force stuck in my arm. My mouth was parched, and my head pounded with a fierce ache. As I glanced around, I noticed my dad sitting in the chair next to my bed. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. When he saw me stirring, he looked over, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. He noticed I was trying to say something and called for the nurse. A young woman in scrubs came in, checked my vitals, and handed me a small piece of ice to moisten my mouth. After it melted, she gave me another. After a few more cubes, I licked my lips and tried again. "How long?" I croaked. "You've been here for about 3 days, Dad replied as the nurse left the room to get the doctor. 3 days? I echoed, stunned. That's right, Dad said. It's Monday now. I got a call from the hospital late Friday night. They said you were dumped outside the ER. You haven't been home since. What happened, son? Later, I managed to say, just as the doctor came in. Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison. I'm Dr. Matthews, he said, offering a kind smile. Glad to see you awake. How are you feeling? Like I got hit by a freight train, I muttered. Everything hurts. I bet it does, he said, nodding. You've taken quite a beating. Nothing's broken, but you've got a couple of bruised ribs and a mild skull bruise. We were worried you might have had a concussion. He checked me over, making some notes on his chart. We're going to take some x-rays just to be sure, and I'd like to keep you one more night for observation. If everything looks good, we'll discharge you tomorrow. I went ahead and called the police, my dad said. It was clear someone attacked you, and I thought we had a responsibility to report it. They'll probably want to speak with you. Do you feel up to it? Yes, doctor, I said, my voice more steady now. I'm ready. All right, Dr. Matthews said. I'll let them know. Maybe they'll be here by the time you're back from radiology. He signaled to the nurse, and she called for the X-ray technician. A few minutes later, I was wheeled down to radiology for scans. When I got back to my room, there was a man in a suit speaking with my father. After I was settled, the man approached me, pulling out his credentials. Mr. Harrison, I'm Detective Michael Stevens, he said, extending his hand. Can you walk me through what happened? Yeah, I said, taking a small sip of water before launching into the story, recounting everything I could remember. Then it hit me, I had my phone with me that day. Did you find my phone? I asked Dad. Yes, he said. Your mom brought the charger, and I plugged it in. Figured you'd need it. He turned on the phone, which had been resting on the bedside table, and handed it to me. There were a few texts from unfamiliar numbers, but I decided to check those later. What mattered now was the audio recording I'd made before the meeting. I found the file and played it for the detective. Everything was there, Montgomery's voice, the punches, the whole scene. I made sure to focus on what happened after they knocked me out. Okay, get him out of here, we heard Jake's voice say. Take him out the back door and drop him at the hospital. If anyone asks, just tell them that's how you found him. Got it? Got it, boss, came Bill's voice, followed by the sounds of shuffling as the guards dragged me off. Then we could hear them talking while they shoved me into the back of a car. Careful, Frank said. Don't want to get blood all over the seats. I'm trying, but he's a stubborn son of a, Bill replied, his frustration clear. Aren't they all? Frank said with a laugh. We heard the door slam, and then the recording ended. We've also got footage from the hospital's security cameras, Detective Stevens said. They drove up, opened the door, and dumped you in the parking lot before speeding off. 2 EMTs spotted you lying there and rushed you inside. We were able to track down the license plate, it's registered to Skyline Corporation. I called your HR department first thing Monday morning to let them know you were here, my dad added. They told me Montgomery had already put you down for a week of sick leave. Any word from Lisa? I asked, my voice strained. Dad shook his head. No, son, he said. I've been trying to reach her at home and on her cell ever since the hospital called. Left voicemails, but haven't heard a thing. She's probably still in Houston, I said bitterly. God only knows what they're doing to her. I'll put her on the wanted list, Stephen said. Issue a bulletin for her. Do you have a recent photo of her? Yeah, I do, I said, reaching into my wallet and pulling out a picture of Lisa. Great, he said, taking the photo. Send this to me along with a copy of that audio recording. I'll forward the photo to the NYPD and issue a warrant for Montgomery and his men. We'll take it from there. I assume you want us to press charges? Absolutely, I replied without hesitation. Good, Stephen said, tucking the photo into his folder. Then leave it to us, Mr. Harrison. You focus on recovering, and we'll take care of the rest. Thank you, Detective, I said. We'll be in touch, Stevens assured me. We might have more questions later. He handed me his business card. Call me if anything else comes to mind. After he left, I turned to my dad, a question gnawing at me. Is what Montgomery said true? I asked. Yes and no, Dad said with a deep sigh. It's true that his father forced himself on your biological mother, and yes, I was made to watch. But your mother was already pregnant when it happened. She didn't know at the time. What happened? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Well, after that night, I filed for divorce, Dad continued. She tried to tell me it was a mistake, that she still loved me. The usual nonsense. But I wasn't having any of it. I moved into the guest room and cut off all contact with her. I also filed a lawsuit against Montgomery and the company for alienation of affection. Back in those days, you could still sue for that. Not long after, she found out she was pregnant, and the court made us wait until you were born before we could proceed. Did you ever do a DNA test? I asked. You were born in 1982, Dad said. This was before they used DNA to establish paternity. We took blood tests, but they were inconclusive. Turns out, you, me, your biological mother, and Montgomery all have the same blood type. I won't bore you with the details, but things at home just kept getting worse. Your biological mother started drinking heavily and using drugs. She died of an overdose about 6 months after you were born. Damn, I muttered, trying to process it all. The lawsuit against Montgomery and his company dragged on for years, but eventually, we settled out of court, Dad said. That's how I got the money to set up your trust fund. As part of the settlement, I agreed not to disclose any details of the case, that's why I couldn't tell you anything. About a year later, I met Anna. She fell in love with you the moment she saw you and insisted on adopting you. After we got married, we found out she couldn't have children of her own, but in her heart, you've always been her son. So, how did you know for sure that I was really your son? I asked, still unsure. Remember that motorcycle accident you had when you were 16? He asked. I remembered it all too well. I was riding on the back of Jimmy Radon's bike. Normally, Jimmy was careful, but that day, he hit a slick patch on the road, and we went down. Luckily, we both had helmets on, which probably saved our lives. Even so, I was still pretty banged up. Yeah, I remember, I said. Well, after that accident, I asked the hospital to run a DNA test, Dad admitted. I needed to know the truth, one way or another. The results came back showing a more than 99% chance that I'm your biological father. That means your mother was already pregnant with you when Montgomery did what he did. As far as I'm concerned, you've always been my dad, no matter what some test says, I told him, which brought a smile to his face. What happened to Montgomery? I asked, my curiosity piqued. He died of a stroke around the time you went off to college, Dad said. After that, his son took over as general director. I had hoped the younger Montgomery learned from his father's mistakes, but clearly, I was wrong. That's why you weren't exactly thrilled about me going to work there, wasn't it? I asked. He nodded. Yes, he said quietly. I wanted to tell you everything, but I couldn't. I was praying I wouldn't have to live through this nightmare again. This isn't on you, Dad, I reassured him. I just can't wrap my head around how Lisa fell for Montgomery's garbage after all these years. It doesn't add up. Who knows? Dad said, shaking his head. From the looks of it, she was drugged, completely out of her mind. Maybe, but something still feels off, I said, feeling uneasy. Why was she there in the first place, dressed like that? Before Dad could respond, there was a knock at the door. Yes. I called out. The door opened a crack, and Barbara poked her head in. Is it okay if I come in? She asked softly. Of course, Barbara, I said. Come on in. What's going on? She stepped inside, carrying a vase full of flowers and a large card. I wanted to bring this for you, she said. Everyone at the office chipped in and signed the card. Thanks, Barbara, I said. Just set the flowers over there, I added, nodding toward the nightstand beside the bed. She handed me the card and placed the flowers where I'd pointed. Then she turned back to face me, looking a bit uncomfortable. I just wanted to say I'm really sorry for everything, she said. Did you know what Montgomery was planning? I asked bluntly. I knew he was up to something with your wife, she said hesitantly. But I didn't know it would end like this, she added, gesturing to me. What exactly happened? I pressed. That morning, he gave me a company credit card and told me to go pick up your wife, she explained. He said she was waiting for me and told me to take her shopping for the shortest, sexiest dress we could find. Afterward, I took her to get her hair done, and he insisted she get a full Brazilian wax. I clenched my jaw, having a pretty good idea of what that meant. So this wasn't the first time he's done this, was it? So, your boss has been using you to train his playthings? Dad asked, his tone dripping with disdain. Barbara's face flushed red, and she looked down, clearly ashamed. Did you know he drugged her? I asked, my voice hardening. He drugs all the women he's with, she said quietly. It's part of his experiments. Has he ever used it on you? Dad asked, his eyes narrowing. Barbara nodded. Once, she said. He gave me just a little, said it was only a quarter of the usual dose. It made me compliant for about an hour. Do you know how much he gave Lisa? I asked. She shook her head. No, I don't know. He told me he gave her 3 times the usual dose, I said. Her eyes widened, and she raised her hands to her mouth in shock. Oh my God, she whispered. I had no idea. Your poor wife must have been losing her mind for hours. She probably didn't even know you were in the room. That stuff really messes with you. When I came into your office, you knew what was about to happen, didn't you? I asked, the weight of it settling in. She nodded again. I knew, she admitted, but I didn't think he'd be so cruel to you. Honestly. Do you know where Montgomery and Lisa are now? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Last I heard, they were still in Houston, she replied. Would you be willing to speak with the police? Dad asked. I'll do everything I can to help, Barbara said, her voice shaky as she looked back at me with tears in her eyes. I'm really, really sorry about all of this, Mr. Harrison. Just one thing, Barbara, I said. What is it? She asked, a bit nervously. Did my wife know what was going to happen? I asked, my tone firm. She nodded slightly. I'm pretty sure she did, Mr. Harrison, she admitted. I know that Mr. Montgomery had been talking to her a lot over the last month, and he'd taken her out for lunch and dinner a few times. I don't know what exactly went down, but he never said anything to me. But you think something happened between them? I pressed. I'd say it's very likely, she replied. But I can't say for sure. You've done things like this for Montgomery before, haven't you? Dad asked, his voice laced with frustration. Yes, quite often, she answered softly. So you approve of what he does? He asked, his patience wearing thin. She shook her head vigorously. No, you don't understand, she said, her voice trembling. I'm a single mom with a special needs child, and Mr. Montgomery pays me well for what I do, and for keeping quiet. Well, it's your silence that landed my son in the hospital this time, Dad said, his temper flaring. Barbara flinched and took a step back, clearly shaken by his words. Honestly, Mr. Harrison, she said, her voice barely a whisper, I didn't know they were going to hurt your son. If I had known, I swear I would have warned him. Dad leaned back in his chair, staring at her without saying a word. Barbara, the police detective will contact you about this, I said. I expect you to fully cooperate. Do you understand? She nodded. Yes, Mr. Harrison, I understand. Good, I said. And tell everyone at the office I appreciate the flowers and the card. I will, she said, wiping away a tear. I'm so sorry again. With that, she turned and left the room. After the door closed, I looked over at Dad. Well, that explains a few things, I said. Emma's been acting a little off since school ended. At first, I thought it was just because Jacob had gone to Redstone Academy. We'll get to the bottom of this, Dad said firmly. Just then, there was another knock at the door, and a hospital orderly came in, pushing a cart loaded with food. Dad smiled and stood up. Looks like dinner's here, he said with a chuckle. Guess that means I should get home before your mother sends out a search party. He laughed. Take care of yourself, son. Get some rest, and we'll see you in the morning. Thanks, Dad, I said. Tell Mom I love her, okay? Will do, son, he said with a smile. And hey, I love you too. We bumped fists, and then he left the room. The orderly gave Dad a friendly nod before setting my food on the tray. It actually smelled pretty good, and since I hadn't eaten in days, my stomach was growling. I dug into the meal, enjoying the meatloaf and mashed potatoes. The mushroom sauce was better than I expected, and even the broccoli wasn't half bad. It wasn't Mom's cooking, but it hit the spot. After finishing my pudding cup and sipping some coffee, I decided to check the messages on my phone. There were 4 texts, each with a video attached. The first message, sent late Friday night, simply said, "Enjoy. Bet you wish you weren't here." The number wasn't familiar, but I opened the video anyway. Instantly, I regretted it. The video showed Emma standing in front of a group of grinning men, wearing that same short dress I'd last seen her in. I recognized the men, they were members of the board of directors. This will definitely add millions to the lawsuit, I thought bitterly. One of the men stepped forward, ripped the dress off her, and threw it aside. Then, Emma began to satisfy him. Her eyes were still glazed over, and I knew she was under the influence of whatever Montgomery had given her. Whether it was from the dose on Friday or something else, I couldn't tell. The video ended there, and I felt like I was going to be sick. Summoning all my strength, I opened the next message, which was dated early Saturday morning. The video began, and once again, I wished I hadn't watched. This time, Emma was with several men, all of them taking turns. The third video, from late Saturday night, showed her lying on her back with her legs spread wide, multiple men having their way with her. The fourth video was different from the others. Dated early Sunday morning, it showed Montgomery and Lisa staring directly into the camera. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she had deep, dark circles under them. I couldn't help but wonder how long they had been tormenting her. Montgomery spoke first. I hope you enjoyed the show, cuck," he sneered. "This is your wife's new life now, so you might as well get used to it." He glanced at Lisa and then back at the camera. "Tell him who I am, honey." "Paul Montgomery is my master," she said, her voice hollow, completely drained of emotion. "That's right," he confirmed. "And what's your new job?" he asked, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "I am my master's sex toy," Lisa replied flatly. "I do whatever he says, with whoever he says, whenever he says, and however he says. As much as he wants." "Good girl," Jake said, clearly satisfied. "Now, tell that cuck he'll never touch you again." Lisa turned toward the camera, pointing directly at it. "You'll never touch me again, cuck," she said, her voice cold and detached. Montgomery laughed as he stared into the camera. "And remember," he added, "don't try anything stupid. The next time I send Frank and Bill to talk to you, you might not wake up. See you later, cuckold. Bye." The video ended, leaving me overwhelmed with emotions, hatred, anger, sadness, and utter disappointment. I could hardly believe what I'd just seen and heard. As far as I could tell, he had completely broken her. I glanced down at the wedding ring on my finger, and in that moment, it meant nothing to me anymore. I slipped it off and tossed it onto the nightstand. Maybe, I thought bitterly, I could pawn it and get a few bucks. One thing was certain, I was going to divorce Lisa. I didn't care what Montgomery thought. I was also determined to make him pay. But how? Alienation of affection lawsuits weren't possible anymore like they had been when my dad divorced. Sure, I wanted to kill the bastard, but honestly, he wasn't worth spending the rest of my life in prison for. Instead, I called Detective Stevens and told him about the videos and the threats Montgomery had made. He asked me to forward everything to him and said he'd be in touch. I followed his instructions and turned off my phone. The thought of calling Lisa crossed my mind, but I quickly dismissed it. It would be a pointless conversation. Instead, I placed my phone on the nightstand and turned on the TV, trying to distract myself from the nightmare I'd just witnessed. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, dreaming of better times when I had a loving, faithful wife. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of nurses bustling around my room, checking my vitals and glancing at the monitors. A couple of them wheeled me down to radiology for another round of X-rays before bringing me back to my room. Once I was settled in bed again, an orderly brought in breakfast. Shortly after I finished eating, Dr. Matthews came in with good news. "Everything looks good," he said with a smile. "You're cleared to go home. I'll write you a prescription for pain management and give you some instructions. The discharge paperwork will take about an hour, so why don't you give your parents a call to pick you up?" "Thanks, Doc," I said. "I'll do that." After he left, I called my parents to let them know the good news. About an hour later, they arrived in my room. Mom pulled me into a tight hug, her face full of concern. When she looked at me, I could see tears welling up in her eyes. "Oh, Mike, I'm so sorry this happened to you," she said, her voice trembling. "How are you feeling?" "I've had better days, Mom," I said, trying to put her at ease. "Well," she said, wiping away her tears, "I made some lasagna for you and left it in the oven to keep warm." I couldn't help but smile. My mom's lasagna was one of my all-time favorite meals, layers of cheese, mushrooms, and meat, all baked to perfection. It was the ultimate comfort food, and just the thought of it made me feel a little better. "Thanks, Mom," I said with a small smile. "Your lasagna always manages to lift my spirits." "I'm glad, son," she said, giving my hand a squeeze. "Your father filled me in on what happened, and I just feel awful. I swear, if I had the chance, I'd throw that woman over my knee and give her a good whipping." Dad and I exchanged a look, both of us chuckling softly. I didn't doubt for a second that if Mom had the chance, she'd have done just that. "So, any updates?" Dad asked. I told him about the videos and Montgomery's threats, making sure to leave out the more graphic parts. And you've got it on video too? Mom asked, her expression darkening. Trust me, Mom, I said quietly, you don't want to see them, they're beyond horrible. She nodded, her face clouded with sadness. I understand. You'll need a good divorce lawyer, Dad said. Yeah, I agreed. There's no way I can move past what she did, or what she's probably still doing. I'll also need to break the news to Jacob. It's going to crush him. Okay, I'll make some calls, Dad said, his voice steady. Just then, a nurse entered the room with my discharge papers and some instructions. They insisted I leave in a wheelchair, so the nurse helped me into one and wheeled me out. Mom and Dad walked alongside us as we made our way to the car. Once outside, I climbed into the back seat, and Dad drove us back to my house. We made a quick stop at the pharmacy to pick up my pain meds on the way. When we arrived home, I noticed my car was sitting in the driveway. Your mom and I picked it up from the office on Saturday, Dad said. Emma's car is still in the garage. I nodded as I followed them inside. The house felt strange, cold and empty without Emma there. The smell of lasagna baking in the oven lightened my mood a bit, though. I hope you don't mind, Mom said, but I tidied up yesterday. It was starting to smell a bit musty in here. I don't mind at all, Mom, I told her. Thanks for everything. I think I can manage from here. Just as I finished speaking, we saw a dark sedan pull up in front of the house. Detective Stevens stepped out of the driver's seat, and another man in a suit exited from the passenger side. I'll get the door, I said, opening it as the two men approached. Detective Stevens, please come in. I introduced them to my parents, and they shook hands. Can I get you something to drink? Mom offered. Coffee? Coke? Stevens shook his head. No, thank you, ma'am. He gestured to the man beside him. Mr. Harrison, this is Detective Hawthorne from the NYPD Homicide Department. The word homicide made my heart skip a beat. My mind was racing as I shook hands with Detective Hawthorne, trying to process what was happening. We all sat down, doing our best to get comfortable despite the tension in the room. Homicide? I asked, barely above a whisper. Hawthorne nodded, handing me a photograph. Can you identify the woman in this picture? He asked. I looked at the photo carefully. It was Lisa, there was no doubt, but her eyes were closed, and her skin had a sickly, pale color. That looks like my wife, Lisa, I said slowly. But she was alive early Sunday morning. I have a video. Did your wife have any distinctive marks or tattoos? Hawthorne asked. Yes, I said. She has a small dolphin tattoo on her upper right thigh. She got it about 15 years ago on a dare. Hawthorne exchanged a glance with Stevens and then turned back to me. I'm very sorry to inform you, Mr. Harrison, but it appears your wife may have been murdered, he said solemnly. Murdered? I gasped. How? When? That's what we're trying to figure out, Hawthorne replied. The coroner is still conducting his examination, but the initial findings suggest she died from a massive heart attack. But wouldn't that make it a natural death? I asked, confused. Hawthorne shook his head. Her body was found in a shallow grave in Lincoln Park yesterday afternoon, he explained. In my experience, that usually points to foul play. We're also waiting on toxicology results, which could tell us more. I sat in stunned silence, trying to wrap my head around it. How could this have happened? What can you tell us, Mr. Harrison? Hawthorne asked gently. I took a deep breath and recounted everything I knew, walking them through the events of the past few days. Detective Stevens took notes, even though I had already shared much of it with him. I pulled out my phone and let them listen to the audio recording. Then, with a heavy heart, I showed them the video. Mom couldn't bear to stay in the room any longer, she started crying, and Dad gently led her out, leaving me to talk to the detectives alone. After they finished watching the video, I shared what Barbara had told me earlier. That explains the bruises and the overall condition of Mrs. Harrison's body, Hawthorne said, his face grim. He turned to me, clearly deep in thought. This woman, Chloe Turner, do you know if she's working today? As far as I know, she should be, I said, still trying to absorb everything. We need to have a conversation with her, Hawthorne said, looking over at Stevens, who nodded in agreement. He turned back to me, his expression growing more serious. What can you tell us about the drugs Montgomery mentioned? Is it this so-called super ecstasy? Not much, just what Barbara mentioned, I replied. The doctors told me that whatever they used on me was out of my system by the time I got to the hospital. What about Montgomery and his men? Stevens asked. Do you have any idea where they might be now? That's actually something we were hoping you could help us with, Stevens said. Henderson's corporate jet left Houston last night. The flight plan said they were supposed to return here, but there's no record of the plane landing. Logan has branches all over the country, I said. They could be anywhere by now. Wonderful, Hawthorne said, sounding frustrated. We'll need to get the FAA involved, and possibly the FBI. I've got a contact at the local FAA office, Stevens said. We can check in with them after we execute the search warrant at Logan. Hawthorne nodded before turning back to me, his expression softening. Mr. Harrison, he said quietly, in the meantime, my team will continue our investigation. We'll release your wife's body as soon as we can, but it could take several days. We'll also track down the individuals from this video and see what we can uncover. I nodded, understanding the weight of the situation. Stevens glanced at Hawthorne before speaking up. I'd like to have a private word with Mr. Harrison, if you don't mind. Hawthorne gave a quick nod. Of course. I've got a few calls to make anyway, I'll be right outside. Before leaving, he turned to me. I'm really sorry about everything, Mr. Harrison. Thank you, Detective, I said, shaking his hand as he stepped out. Once we were alone, Stevens sat down across from me, his expression empathetic. Rick, he began, I wanted to talk to you about what happened to your wife, and I thought it best to do it privately. I appreciate that, Detective, I said, bracing myself for what was coming. I won't go into the graphic details, Stevens said, his voice low, but from what I've read and seen, her last 48 hours were nothing short of hell. I don't believe your wife was complicit in what happened to her. I think she was brutalized by a group of twisted, power-hungry men. Look, Stevens, I interrupted, I get what you're trying to say, and I appreciate it. But the truth is, Lisa was involved with Montgomery before any of this started. She had chances to stop it long before Friday, but she didn't. I'll never understand why she did what she did, and now, I'll never have the chance to ask her. Stevens nodded, his voice soft. I understand, he said. He reached into his pocket and handed me a business card. I think it'd be a good idea for you to speak with Dr. Harmon. She's one of the best in trauma counseling. Please give her a call. Thanks, Detective, I said, taking the card. I'm also concerned that Montgomery's guys might try to come after you again, Stevens added. I'd assign a couple of officers to keep an eye on you, but we're stretched thin right now. However, I've made sure that patrols in your area will be doubled. I appreciate that, I said, feeling a bit of relief. One last thing, do you own a gun? Stevens asked. No, I replied. He nodded. All right, just keep your doors and windows locked, and if anything feels off or you see anything suspicious, call 911 immediately. I will, I said, standing up to shake his hand as we wrapped up our conversation. Just then, Hawthorne came back into the room. I just spoke with your partner, Johnson, he said to Stevens. They're ready for us to execute the search warrant at Logan. Stevens nodded, and both detectives prepared to leave. We'll be in touch, Rick, Stevens said, shaking my hand once more. Hawthorne extended his hand too. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Harrison." "Thank you, Detective," I replied. After they left, my parents came back in, still looking worried. Dad gave me a long, thoughtful look. "Are you going to be okay, son?" he asked, his voice full of concern. "I think so, Dad," I said, though deep down, I wasn't entirely sure. I still had difficult phone calls to make, one to Jacob, who needed to know what had happened to his mom, and another to Lisa's parents. I dreaded both conversations, knowing they'd be incredibly painful. Staring at my phone, I realized just how tough the road ahead was going to be. But there was no way around it. The first call I had to make was to Jacob. I dialed his number, and it rang a few times before going to voicemail. I took a deep breath and left a message. "Hey, Jacob, it's Dad. I need to talk to you about something important. Call me back when you can, okay? Love you, son." I hung up and let out a heavy sigh. That conversation would have to wait. I wasn't looking forward to telling my son about what had happened to his mother, especially knowing how close they were. It was going to devastate him. Next, I dialed Lisa's parents. I wasn't sure how to break the news, but they deserved to know. After a few rings, Jack Edwards, Lisa's father, a retired Marine colonel, picked up. His voice was just as strong and commanding as I remembered. "Edwards' residence," he said. "Hey, Dad, it's Rick," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Rick, what's wrong? You sound like someone just kicked your dog," Jack said, his tone stern but with a touch of fatherly warmth. "No, Dad. It's worse than that. I just got out of the hospital, and I found out that Lisa is dead." There was a long silence on the other end. I could almost hear him trying to process what I'd just said. When he spoke again, his voice was filled with concern. "Dead? Hospital? What in the hell happened, son?" I gave him a brief explanation of what had occurred, leaving out the most horrifying details. Jack was quiet for a while. I could almost feel the wheels turning in his mind as he took it all in. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, but there was a sharpness to it. "We'll be there at 1800 hours, he said. "That's 6 p.m. for you civilian types." "I know, Dad," I replied, letting out a small chuckle despite the weight of the moment. "And have some strong coffee ready for us when we get there," Jack added. "I'll make sure of it," I said before we hung up. As soon as I set the phone down, the full weight of everything crashed down on me. Lisa was gone. The woman I had loved for over 20 years was dead. No matter how angry I'd been with her, I never wanted this. I broke down, sobbing as the reality of what I had lost hit me like a freight train, not just my wife, but the life we had built together. After a few minutes, I pulled myself together, wiped my eyes, and headed into the kitchen. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, strong enough for Jack's taste. I knew how punctual the colonel was, so I expected them to arrive right on time. Sure enough, at exactly 6 p.m., the doorbell rang. I opened the door to see Jack and Lisa's mother, Laura, standing there. Jack still looked as tough as ever, but there was a softness in his eyes as he pulled me into a tight hug. "Damn it, son," he said, stepping back and looking at me. "Didn't anyone teach you to duck?" I managed a half smile. "My dad tried, but I guess I never quite got the hang of it." They stepped inside, and as they did, I noticed another car pull into the driveway. A tall, lanky man got out and walked toward the house, carrying a laptop bag and a couple of other bags in hand. "I hope you don't mind," Jack said as he noticed me watching the man approach. "After what you told me, I figured it'd be smart to call in some reinforcements." The tall man entered, and Jack introduced us. "Rick, this is Ron Wiseman. We served together in the Corps. Ron, meet my son-in-law, Rick Harrison." "Good to meet you, Ron," I said, shaking his hand. "Likewise, Rick," Ron replied, his grip firm. "Please, just call me Ron." I glanced back at Jack, still trying to understand why he'd brought in reinforcements. Jack noticed my confusion and continued. "Ron and his wife have some experience dealing with men like Montgomery. He's got a certain set of skills that might come in handy." "What kind of skills?" I asked, intrigued. "I'm an accountant, by trade," Ron said with a slight smile, but the tone in his voice suggested there was a lot more to it than that. "An accountant?" I repeated, still unsure. Ron's smile widened as he set down his bags. "Well, a bit more than that," he said. "I work with a special task force, and I've got access to some information that might be useful, given what Jack's told me." "I see," I said, starting to grasp the bigger picture. "Well, have a seat. I'll grab us some coffee." Laura joined me in the kitchen, helping carry cups back to the living room where Ron, Jack, and I settled down. "Why don't you bring us up to speed, Rick?" Jack said, his voice steady but full of authority. I laid everything out for them, the whole story, from Montgomery's assault on Lisa to my time in the hospital and the horrific videos I had received. Ron listened intently, asking a few questions here and there, while jotting down notes. "You mentioned video recordings?" Jack asked, a serious look crossing his face. "Yeah," I replied, hesitating. "But they're not easy to watch." "I still need to see them," Jack insisted. "Don't worry, after 30 years in the Corps, Laura and I have seen just about everything." Reluctantly, I handed him my phone and queued up the videos. Jack, Laura, and Ron watched in silence, pausing at times to examine certain moments more closely. By the time they were done, I could see the barely contained anger simmering beneath Jack's composed demeanor. Laura looked on the verge of tears, while Ron stayed calm, as if processing every detail. "She was definitely drugged," Laura said, her voice shaky. Jack and Ron both nodded in agreement. "But I don't know with what exactly," I added. "Barbara mentioned something about super ecstasy or some new drug Montgomery had developed," Ron said, still focused on the screen of his laptop. "And Montgomery drugged you too, right?" Jack asked, his voice lower now. "Yeah," I nodded. "But by the time I got to the hospital, it was already out of my system." Ron had his laptop open now, booting up as he asked, "Those two thugs who beat you, were they in the videos?" "Yeah," I said, pointing to Frank Smith and George Walker on the paused frame of the video. "Send me the videos," Ron said, handing me a piece of paper with his email address. I nodded and forwarded the files to him. After a few moments of silence, Ron looked up from his laptop. "Those guys, they aren't who they say they are." "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling a chill run through me. "They're ex-gangsters," Ron explained. "Used to work for a guy named Jimmy the Weasel. The feds have been looking for them ever since their boss was found murdered. They've been off the radar for years, until now." "How long have they been working for Montgomery?" I asked, the pieces slowly starting to fit together. "At least a couple of years, from what I can dig up," Ron replied, typing away. "They disappeared around the same time. I wouldn't be surprised if Montgomery's been on the feds' radar too, given his connections." Jack leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "So, what's the plan?" "We're going to track these guys down," Ron said, his voice calm but determined. "The Colonel and I will handle it from here. In the meantime, Rick, I'm staying with you. I don't like the idea of you being here alone while these guys are still out there." I nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. "Thanks, Ron. I appreciate it." "Don't worry," Ron said, glancing over at Jack. "We Marines always take care of our own." Jack stood up, signaling that our meeting was coming to an end. Laura and Ron followed his lead. Before leaving, Jack surprised me by pulling me into a strong, fatherly hug. "Everything will be fine, son," Jack said, his voice filled with reassurance. Laura hugged me tightly. "I'm so sorry this happened, Rick," she said softly. "Don't worry about anything, okay?" "I won't, Mom," I replied, grateful for their support. After they left, Ron and I spent the rest of the evening talking about our next steps. He promised to keep me updated on any new information he came across. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone ringing. It was Alex. I took a deep breath and answered, knowing this was the conversation I had been dreading. "Hey, Dad," Alex said, his voice sounding tired. "I got your message. What's going on?" I braced myself, trying to find the right words. "Alex," I started, my voice heavy. "There's something I need to tell you, about your mom." I explained everything as gently as I could. There was a long silence on the other end as he processed the news. "That just doesn't sound like something she would do," Alex finally said, his voice shaky with disbelief. "I know, son," I said, my heart aching. "It doesn't make sense to me either." "Is there any clue why?" Alex asked, struggling to understand. "Anything that explains it?" "I haven't found much," I admitted. "I went through her phone and email, but nothing stood out." "Maybe she had a burner phone," Alex suggested. "A burner phone?" I repeated, surprised by the idea. "Yeah, one of those cheap, disposable phones," Alex explained. "Maybe she had one hidden somewhere." The thought hit me like a lightning bolt. The videos had been sent from a number I didn't recognize. Could that have been a burner phone? If so, it might explain why nothing showed up on her regular phone. "You might be onto something," I said, feeling a sense of urgency. "I'll look into it." We talked for a few more minutes, and I promised to keep him updated as we uncovered more information about his mother. After hanging up, I mentioned the burner phone theory to Ron. "That makes a lot of sense," Ron agreed. "Do you still have the number from those videos?" "Yeah," I said, pulling up the messages on my phone. Ron quickly ran the number through his system, and within minutes, he had an answer. "The number's linked to a burner phone purchased locally," Ron confirmed. "It's registered to Logan and was last active on Tuesday morning in New York City. There hasn't been any activity since the last video you received." I nodded, another piece of the puzzle falling into place, but it still left so many unanswered questions. I knew we were getting closer, but there was a long road ahead. Ron leaned back, his eyes scanning the data on his laptop. "It looks like the burner phone's gone dark since Tuesday," he said. "But at least we know it's tied to Logan. That might help us narrow things down." I nodded again, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle even deeper. The pieces were starting to come together, but the full picture was overwhelming. "How long do you think they'll stay in hiding?" I asked, my voice low, as I tried to grasp how long this might drag on. Ron shrugged. "Depends on how bold they are. Guys like Montgomery don't stay hidden forever. Eventually, they get overconfident or make a mistake. Either way, we'll find him." I appreciated his confidence, but I wasn't counting on a quick or easy resolution. I had to stay focused and take things one step at a time. Later that day, after getting the guest room ready for Ron, I found myself reflecting on everything that had unfolded. Emma's betrayal, the videos, the assault, it all felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I tried to keep busy by cleaning the house and going through some of Emma's old belongings, but every corner of the home held memories of our life together. A life that now felt like it had been built on lies. On Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of bacon frying in the kitchen. Ron's wife, Amy, had arrived, and the two of them were busy preparing breakfast. I wasn't sure what their plans were for the day, but I was grateful for their company. After everything that had happened, it was comforting to have people around. The house didn't feel as empty anymore, and for a brief moment, I didn't feel so alone. Amy greeted me with a warm smile. "Hope you don't mind me taking over your kitchen," she said, flipping the bacon. "Ron gets grumpy without his breakfast." I chuckled. "Not at all. I get a little cranky myself if I skip a good meal. We all sat down to eat, and for a brief moment, things felt almost normal again. But just beneath the surface, I knew the storm was still raging. I couldn't forget that I needed justice for Emma, and I had to make sure Montgomery and his crew paid for everything they'd done. As we finished up, there was a knock on the door. When I opened it, I found Detective Stevens standing there, looking more serious than usual. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. "Sure, come on in," I said, stepping aside to let him in. I introduced him to Ron and Amy, explaining they were friends of my father-in-law. Stevens nodded in greeting, then turned his attention back to me. "I wanted to give you an update," he said, his voice heavy. "Montgomery and 2 of his top men were arrested early this morning in San Diego." A wave of relief washed over me, though it was mixed with the lingering weight of everything that still needed to be dealt with. "That's great news, right?" I asked, needing to hear confirmation. Stevens nodded. "It is. From what I've heard, they've already started cooperating with the authorities. Looks like they're spilling everything. But there's more to it, isn't there?" I pressed, sensing he hadn't finished. Stevens hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Ron and Amy before looking back at me. "There's just a few irregularities about how they were apprehended," he said carefully. "I don't suppose you know anything about that, do you?" I glanced over at Ron, who remained calm, showing no hint of reaction. "Nope," I replied, keeping my voice even. "I've been here all night. Ron and Amy can back me up on that." Stevens nodded but didn't push further. "Well, just thought I'd keep you in the loop. Take care of yourself, Rick." "Thanks, Detective," I said, walking him to the door. As soon as Stevens left, I turned to Ron with a raised eyebrow. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Ron gave me a knowing grin. "Let's just say, it's better not to ask questions you don't want the answers to. But if I were you, I'd give your father-in-law a call. A thank you might be in order." I didn't press further. By now, I knew Jack had his own ways of getting things done. Taking Ron's advice, I called Jack later that afternoon. "Hey, Dad," I said when he picked up. "Just wanted to let you know, Montgomery and his guys got picked up in San Diego. The cops came by earlier to tell me." "Well, that's good news," Jack replied, sounding pleased. "About damn time. Ron suggested I give you a call and thank you," I said, knowing there was more to the story than what I was hearing. "Did he now?" Jack said, his tone carrying a hint of amusement. "Well, I appreciate the thanks. Let's just say, sometimes things have a way of working out." I smiled, grateful for Jack's unshakable support, even if I didn't fully understand how everything had come together. "Thanks, Dad," I said sincerely. "I appreciate everything you've done." "You're welcome, son. Take care of yourself," Jack said before we ended the call. With Montgomery and his crew now in custody, things started to move quickly. By the following Monday, I went into work and handed in my resignation. My colleagues were sorry to see me go, but they understood why I couldn't stay. Logan was no longer a place I could call home, not after everything that had happened. After that, I contacted a realtor to begin the process of selling the house. The thought of staying there, where every room was filled with memories of Emma and the life we had shared, was unbearable. It was time to move on, even if it meant leaving behind 2 decades of memories. A week passed, and we finally got word from the medical examiner in New York. Emma's body had been released, and her parents made arrangements for the funeral. I had mixed feelings about attending the service. On one hand, I had loved Emma for over 20 years, and it felt right to say goodbye. But on the other hand, I was still struggling with the pain of her betrayal. I couldn't stop wondering if it was the drugs that had changed her or if there had been something deeper going on all along. In the end, I decided to go to the funeral, mainly for Jack and Laura. They had always treated me well, and I owed them that much. Alex managed to get a few days off from Redstone Academy to attend, and despite the circumstances, it was good to see him again. We mourned together, sharing memories of better times when we were still a family. I made the decision not to tell Alex the full truth about his mother's last days. He had always been close to Emma, and there was no point in tarnishing those memories for him. Let him hold on to the good times, that was all he needed. With the funeral behind me, my focus shifted to the legal battles ahead. I met with a lawyer to discuss a lawsuit against Logan Corporation. The attorney was confident that we had a strong case, especially given the criminal charges Montgomery and his board members were now facing. It wouldn't be an easy fight, but I was ready to see it through. The criminal trial dragged on, feeling like it would never end. The U.S. attorney pushed for the death penalty for Montgomery, but his defense team threw every delay tactic they could at the case. I gave my testimony and provided all the evidence I had about what had happened to me and Emma. Others came forward as well, including Barbara, who revealed that Emma wasn't the only woman Montgomery had drugged and abused. When the dust finally settled, Montgomery, his two goons, and everyone else involved in that weekend of horrors were found guilty on all counts. The judge spared Montgomery from the death penalty but handed him a life sentence. His accomplices weren't as lucky, they'd be spending decades behind bars. The rest of the men involved got lighter sentences, but they'd still face years of imprisonment. Civil lawsuits followed, and Logan Corporation took a massive hit. By the time everything was said and done, the company had lost most of its clients and was on the brink of bankruptcy. Montgomery's empire crumbled to nothing, leaving him with no legacy, no power, just a prison cell. The consequences of his twisted games were far greater than he could have imagined. Emma was gone, and hundreds of people lost their jobs as the company spiraled into collapse. As for me, life carried on. I eventually sold the house and moved into a smaller, two-bedroom apartment. It felt strange leaving the place I had called home for so many years, but it was a necessary step in moving forward. My therapist encouraged me to take some time to focus on myself, suggesting I take a vacation and try to meet new people. So, I took her advice. I booked an around-the-world cruise. With my bags packed and ticket in hand, I hopped into a taxi headed for the airport, ready to embark on a new chapter. As I stared out the window, watching the world go by, I couldn't help but wonder what the future had in store for me. Maybe I'd meet someone new on this cruise, someone who could help me piece together the parts of my broken heart. Or maybe, for once, I'd focus on myself, letting life unfold however it would. Whatever came next, one thing was certain, I was ready. The past was behind me, and my future, whatever it held, was waiting to be lived.